Welcome back, book lovers. So I thought it could be really fun today to do the booktube staple, the Jane Austen ranking. But rather than doing them in the order that I most enjoyed them or that are my favourite reads, I thought it would be fun to rank them in order of how romantic I find them. And I just want to say I love Jane Austen. I love all of her books. I'm also aware that Jane Austen wasn't always necessarily trying to be romantic. Like, quite often she was being satirical, she was writing social commentary on the marriage market in the moors of the time. Some of her books in some places could even be described, I think, as kind of anti-romance, but I think that most people these days read Jane Austen, certainly the more popular Jane Austens, for the romance. The film adaptations tend to be heavy on the romance. Everyone loves Mark Darcy. So I thought it would be nice to kind of rank them in that way. So let's get started. So the least romantic Jane Austen, I think, and this may be a controversial choice because I know a lot of people love this book. This is an absolute favourite of her work. But this isn't a reflection on how much I enjoyed the book. But I do just find this the romance just isn't there for me. And that would be Emma. I love Emma. I think it's a great book. I love Emma as a character. I'm going to read you what this blurb says about her. Emma is the story of a clever, albeit spoiled woman, Emma Woodhouse, who lives with her father. Emma is not an instantly likeable girl. At first glance, she seems rather selfish and arrogant. The world around her, however, caters to her whims and fancies for the most part, except one Mr. Knightley, who is frank in his judgment and opinion of her. And indeed he is. So as the blurb says, Emma is the heroine of the story. She is clever, she's pretty, she's witty, she's also quite selfish and spoiled. She has plans on being a spinster. She doesn't need a husband for the money. She's got her own inheritance. And she has a love of matchmaking, and she sort of goes around the small community that she lives in, matchmaking or meddling, as the case may be, and just causing absolute chaos and getting all of it wrong. And it's a really smart, funny book. And of course, she ends up with the mentioned Mr. Knightley, who is one of the only people who is kind of brave enough to tell Emma the truth about herself. And this, I feel like this could be a great sort of grumpy sunshine novel if it wasn't for the fact of the really icky age gap. Emma is, I think, maybe 19, I think. She might be slightly younger. And Mr. Knightley is probably around late 30s, 40s. It wouldn't be too problematic, especially for the moors of the time. This was quite common if there wasn't the immortal line in this book where Mr. Knightley is confessing his feelings to Emma, where he tells her, "I have loved you since you were 13. Now, I think the age of consent at that time was 13, so this wouldn't have been considered necessarily problematic when she wrote it, or would it? Sometimes with Jane Austen, it's hard to tell. You know, you're never quite sure if she's poking fun at something or trying to make a point. But certainly to a lot of people in the Regency period, particularly in the middle and upper classes, very young women, girls were married to much older men. But yeah, this lands differently reading it in the 21st century. This is just, I can't buy the romance between Emma and Mr. Knightley at all. And I kind of wish it didn't happen. I know that it probably wouldn't have been possible in this time period for Jane Austen to write this ending, but I feel like it would be a much better book if Emma just stayed a spinster and kind of carried on her matchmaking. I think that would be a much better book. So that's Emma. The next least romantic of Jane Austen novels, I feel, although it is one of my absolute favourites of her books, is Sense and Sensibility. I feel like this book is a sisters before Mister's book. The focus is on the two sisters, the main characters, Eleanor and Marianne, who are represented by the title, Sense and Sensibility. Eleanor is the sense. She has a lot of common sense. She's very practical. Marianne is the sensibility. And in that time period, the word refers to a kind of depth of emotional feeling. So Marianne is She's very dramatic. She's in love with the idea of being in love. She reads a lot of poetry. She wants a kind of brooding man. And the best bit of this book is the sisters' relationship and how that grows and changes, and how the sisters themselves grow and change. The men they end up with is kind of blur. Eleanor ends up with a guy called Edward Ferrars, who is just kind of doesn't have much of a personality. He's also a bit of a dick. He lies to her about the fact that he's engaged to someone else. He finally sort of comes through at the end, but it's all very underwhelming. There are no sort of, really passionate scenes with these two. You kind of get the sense that Eleanor just kind of settles for something safe. And Marianne sadly ends up doing the same after her first love, who is a lot of a dick, kind of lets her down and turns out to be just not good news. She settles for the much older guy who has been in love with her for quite a while, who until this she had no interest in, and she really does settle. Like, even the story kind of makes it obvious that she settles, that this isn't a big love affair, at least not for her. And again, I kind of find the age gap icky. I think Marianne is about 17 in this story. Colonel Brandon is probably pushing 40. It just, again, not too unusual for the time period. Feels very different now, and it's just, it just doesn't work well in this day and age. And yeah, I just don't like it. I kind of wish, I don't know. I just kind of wish Marianne had ended up with someone else, and Edward Ferrars had been he'd just had a bit more oomph about him. Definitely, I think the focus of that book is the sisters and their relationship rather than the romances. So that's why I think it's one of the least romantic. The next one, which is not really very romantic either, perhaps because I think both of the main characters are quite insipid. This is probably my least favourite of Jane Austen's works, and it's Mansfield Park. So Mansfield Park follows Fanny, who is adopted by her much richer aunt and uncle, and from a fairly young age is in love with her cousin Edmund, but Edmund is in love with someone else throughout most of the book, and Fanny has to kind of watch this and endure this and not say anything. She has a marriage proposal from a guy who's completely unsuitable. She's very forthright in turning it down, which is quite a brave thing for her to do. I still find her just quite dull as a character. Edmund's quite dull as a character. He only ends up with a very underwhelming proposal, ends up with Fanny when the girl that he likes lets him down. Again, you just get the sense that he's kind of settling. Like, oh my God, my cousin Fanny, I've realised what a lovely person you are, and you're so in love with me. Let's make it happen. It's just all very underwhelming. I think Jane Austen almost deliberately writes this, particularly the ending, to be quite underwhelming. And so Fanny kind of gets her happy ending. Her happy ending is the fact that she gets to keep the house that she loves, rather than about the man. So although it's a nice read, and there's a lot of social commentary in this, it's definitely not the most romantic. The next book, so the third most romantic in my ranking, would be Northanger Abbey. This is the earliest of Jane Austen's novels, although it was published quite close to the end of her works. In fact, I think after she died, along with her final work, Persuasion, or her final finished work. But it was actually written when she was much younger. And this is a hilarious book. It's so funny. A lot of this book is Jane Austen sort of kind of roasting the Gothic novels that were around at the time. But also kind of not, because she also takes a pop at the people who roast the women who read Gothic novels. So it's very much a satire and a commentary on kind of reading habits of the day and how people felt about women writing and women reading. And a lot of the book is about that. It's also about just a really nice coming of age story where a girl called Catherine goes to Bath for the first time, meets new people, starts to get guys interested in her. She ends up with a guy called Henry Tilney, who's quite possibly the hottest clergyman that Jane Austen's written. And it's really sweet. I won't give the central plot away, which is related to the kind of this gothic satire that she does, because it's just really good. But the ending is quite romantic, I think. Henry kind of follows her to her home and comes after her, and they end up together, and it is really sweet. The banter between her and Henry throughout the book is great, and it is a really nice, sweet romance. Second most romantic of Jane Austen's novels is, I believe, The Mighty Pride and Prejudice. I feel like this is the original enemies to lovers. The banter between Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet, and the way that they become almost sworn enemies in a sense. He's really, this is definitely a Grumpy and Sunshine. I feel like Jane Austen has inspired so many of our modern romance tropes. I think if you're a romance lover, you have to read Pride and Prejudice. How they end up together is fantastic. He fights for her, she fights for him. They're the kind of couple that shouldn't end up together. Elizabeth Bennet, at least for the social circle that she moves in, is poor. Mr. Darcy is rich. There are so many reasons why these two shouldn't end up together, but they do. And following their journey from kind of disliking each other to outright hating each other to secretly being in love with each other to finally getting it on is just a really good read. Also, Jane Austen's wit, I think, is really at the forefront in this book. It just, the first pages describing Mr. and Mrs. Bennet made me laugh out loud. So this is a romantic comedy in a lot of ways, and just a really great read. If you're going to read any classic romance, I think it has to be Pride and Prejudice. And that brings me to the book I feel is the most romantic of Jane Austen's. It's also my favourite work of hers. I love this book. It's one of my all-time favourite books, and that's Persuasion by Jane Austen. As I said, this is her final finished work. You can see that her writing is more mature in this than something like Northanger Abbey or Pride and Prejudice. It's not as funny as them, although her trademark wit is still very much there. This is a second chance romance. So it's about a couple who were together before, but they couldn't be together because of families and money considerations. And then 8 years later, Captain Wentworth turns back up in Anne Elliot's life, and she's still in love with him. He seems to still hold a grudge at her for turning her down because he wasn't rich enough. Now he's very rich and making googly eyes at her new best friend. It's just a lovely read. There's a scene near the end where he drops a letter for her, and then he leaves. He's supposed to be leaving for the Navy, and she kind of runs after him. I think it's the most romantic scene in all of Jane Austen. I absolutely adore it. Adore it? Love and adore it, I think I was trying to say there. I'll read this quote off the back of the book. "You pierce my soul. I am half agony, half hope. I have loved none but you." I think that just sums up the book. I don't know if it's because the protagonist is slightly older in this. She's only 27, but she's like on the shelf in the Regency period to get married, or perhaps it's because Jane Austen's that bit older when she writes this. But this does feel like more of an autumnal work, her most mature work. So maybe I love this so much now because I'm older. I don't know. I think years ago my favourite probably would have been Pride and Prejudice, but now it's definitely this one. And when they finally get back together, I just adore it. I just think it's a beautiful book, beautifully written, really nice romance. And so that is my romantic ranking of Jane Austen. And if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more content by me, definitely some more content about Jane Austen, romances, classic novels, please like and subscribe. It really does help booktubers, especially new booktubers. And that's all for today. And I will see you soon, book lovers.